Hello and welcome to Ukraine Today. We're in location in the western Ukrainian city of Chernivtsi at the Meridian Czernowitz 2015 Poetry Festival. Joining me today is Igor Pomerantsev. He's one of the founders of the festival, and alongside that he is also a poet, critic, broadcaster and playwright. Igor.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
Many thanks for coming to speak with us. You're joining us on the day 3 of the festival, the third and final day. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your impressions so far, how things have gone.
You know, impressions are both good and a bit dark, because the festival, the second year, already is under a heavy shadow of the war. And the word festival is a bit misleading, because festival is a feast. But during the war, I think one could feel some moral discomfort taking part in a feast. That's why it's a specific festival. If you could listen to poets who read their poetry and recited their poetry here, you could hear and feel and understand that almost every poem was penetrated with war in that or another case. There were many poems by young women, and you could feel their sorrow for young soldiers, for their brothers, or for their even fathers. They are very young. Husbands, yeah. And so this shadow is dense, heavy, but at the same time, the poetry itself is a kind of resistance towards the death. Because the idea of poetry will do something, will write something, and it will stay forever. And this forever is very important. The nature of poetry itself is anti-war, anti-death, and it's as if looking forward in under any circumstances. That's why this festival is a kind of gesture of solidarity and resistance.
At the same time, I know that you wrote for us at Ukraine Today a post not too long ago. And in that post, you wrote that culture, paraphrasing here, but culture must warm its hands on the blood of war.
You know, culture uses any situation to create something, with the exception if you are in a line to a gas chamber in a concentration camp. But generally, poetry, culture, they are as if noble parasites of any situation. And if you look back at American literature or English literature, during the World War I especially, because it was great poetry created by English poets during the war, most of them perished. Most of them, by the way, were killed. And they took part in a war, not like poets, but like soldiers.
Are you thinking here of Wilfred Owen?
Yes, exactly. Actually, I think this team of poets, they created new war language in poetry generally, which in a way was followed during and after the World War II. But I think first in the history of wars, especially English poets of this war generation, they created new vocabulary, new perception. They wrote not something heroic. They wrote just about blood, sweat, amputated limbs, lice in air, loss of sight. It's a bleeding poetry, and in a way, here I am recollecting quite often their poetry.
I wonder that these soldiers themselves perhaps are not always able to tell people what they've been through. And if they're traumatized now, it can be difficult for them to get that message to the Ukrainian people.
You know, it's not even the feeling of responsibility. I think it's a gesture of despair from me, because I'm 67 years old. And actually, I can't be mobilized. I can't take part practically. So this is the feeling of despair that I should do something. And for me, it's a self-therapy to do something, to write some poetry about war and making films about war. We shoot as well 4 minutes film based on my already war poetry. And sincerely saying, I don't know whether it takes part in the process, whether it helps anybody, but at least it helps me to keep up the standard of my psychological state. So it's a double process. From outside, one could see that, one could think that it's that my solidarity is simply and the gesture directed to the front. First of all, I'm afraid I'm emotionally involved. I need those films. I don't know whether those soldiers or military psychologists need it, although they took part in it.
Did you know straight away when everything happened in Ukraine in 2014 with the Maidan, the pro-EU uprising, and we had the annexation of Crimea by Moscow, and then the war began in the east, and did you feel straight away when all this started taking place that you had a role to play, and for your own emotional and psychological well-being that you needed to document this and be a part of this in some way? Or did that come more slowly?
No, immediate. It's an immediate reaction. Look, it's a healthy psychological and emotional reaction towards the crime. It was an international crime, and we were the witnesses. And I'm not just outside. I was brought up in Chernivtsi. I used to live in Kiev. So Ukraine is a close emotional zone for me. No, of course I felt it was a shock for all people who were involved in it. You know, we took it as a great pain immediately. Fortunately, I work for the radio. I work for an American radio, Radio Free Europe Liberty, at the Russian service. And I make, in a way, cultural programs, but I think already I broadcast no less than 50 programs in that or another way connected with Ukrainian war, and most of those programs were done either by me when I visit Ukraine or by my correspondents in Kharkiv. It's a France city, with refugees, wounded soldiers, people who were on the volunteers who play colossal role in Ukraine, actually more important than the state. In Ukraine there are more than 1 million volunteers, and all the hope is on civil society, on volunteers, much more than on the state. But at least on radio I could react in my verbal acoustic way. So I think, in a way, I don't know whether it helped anybody, but it helped me.
On that question of civil society, I wonder what you think. What awaits Ukraine on that front in the future? In the sense of, we will have many young men coming back from the front, and we hope that this conflict will soon end, or some kind of resolution can be found. And what will the future be for Ukraine in that sense? And what role will culture and literature play in that role? Will we see a blooming of literature and culture in response to these events?
Look, I'm not a futurologist. I can't forecast. I know only that what we have a watch, you see, and still 100 years ago, the most important hand was an hour hand. I think 30 years ago it was a minute hand, most important. Now we live in a time when the second hand is the most important and decisive. This is what I'm speaking about, that now time is more dynamic, and the conflict will go more dynamic, and the war will be over, I think, soon, because we live in another age. We can't expect 100 years war or 30 years war like in old times in Europe. But what you are asking about is about the future. The future is, in a way, standard. We have the experience of Vietnam War in America, and many soldiers returned wounded, both physically and mentally, and there is a colossal experience of it, described by military psychologists in the United States. Plus, there is always the rise of criminality, because the war changes our concept of the value of life and death. So it's inevitable that we expect here social and civil problems. That's one side. Another side, that's what political scientists write, that this war could help somehow to make a profile of political nation, of a state. Ukraine, by its nature, most of it, seems to me more close culturally to Mediterranean way. And we know that in Italy, for instance, the communities are much more strong than the state. And all my hope in Ukraine is not on the state, but on communities, on instinct for survival, life. Ukrainians love, for instance, enjoying love. They enjoy good food. They are not ascetic, you know. And this sensuous aspect of Ukraine, for me, is optimistic. People who enjoy life, they fight for it. And in the end, they win, because Ukraine and Ukrainians have colossal will for life, unlike to some cultures which have the will for death.
Mr. Pomerantsev, many thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
This has been Rahim Tula with Igor Pomerantsev in Chernivtsi. This is Ukraine Today.